It's a good time. Thank you and welcome everyone to our GHG Planning webinar. It's about setting a target, but then thinking about what happens after that. A lot of organizations have set GHG and carbon reduction targets, and we thought we would share with you what the next steps are, after that's been done. I'm going to begin today's session with our land acknowledgement. I want to recognize that we work and we play and we hear some plans for the weekends that everyone has on the traditional lands for many Indigenous peoples throughout the province and throughout Canada. I'm leading this session today from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I want to invite you to take a moment to write in the chat the name of the territory from which you're joining us today as well. So I'll give you a moment to do so. I'm honored and pleased to be joined with a really expert panel today from Prism Engineering. We have Liz, who's a professional engineer working out of the Prism's Nelson office and focusing on GHG emissions reductions projects and low carbon retrofits. We have Julianne, who's a climate action specialist and works with organizations to help them strategically reduce their GHG emissions and adapt their buildings to be more climate resilient. And we have Sam, who's a principal and runs our Kootenay branch office at Nelson, BC. He works closely with organizations around the province to plan for and identify decarbonization projects, and he's going to be sharing some of his project work today with us. What our plan is in terms of outcomes today is to really have an opportunity to give you a chance to see how you can go from setting targets to taking action. It's not just about what the numbers are for 2025 or 2030 or 2040. It's we want to get there, and we want to do things that enable our organizations to get there. So we want to share with you some frameworks for that, some strategies, but also some actual examples of organizations that have done the planning phase. I can't say that they've done hitting all their targets just yet, but certainly they've done the planning phases for that, and hopefully get some inspiration. We hope to motivate you and inspire you to take action around setting up your own GHG reduction plans. Our agenda breaks down this approach into five parts. We're going to start with a bit of an introduction. I'm going to give a bit of context setting around our company, but very quickly we'll get into the why. We'll hear from Julianne about the context setting and why we're here. Then we're going to move into the how. And Sam will take us through the planning process and the engagement process and the framework that we've established to make this happen. And then we'll move into a couple of case studies where Liz and Sam will both share some lessons learned and experiences, and we'll wrap up and summarize those lessons learned at the end. We'll have time for questions between the speakers. We'll also be monitoring the chat, and we'll have time at the end. And if we don't get through all the questions during the 1 hour that we've set aside, the speakers have all agreed to stay behind for an extra half hour, and we can address any questions and sort of the extra time if you're able to stay. But we want to respect people's commitment to an hour, and we'll have the formal part done by top of the hour. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those and sharing those out to the presenters. So I'm going to start just with a quick introduction about Prism Engineering and who we are and where we've been. It's an exciting time for us. I was involved at the beginning over 32 years ago with Prism, and now we're a team of over 50. We're helping organizations reduce not only energy, but their carbon use around the province and throughout Western Canada. We really differentiate ourselves by not just doing evaluations and studies, but by being able to provide more comprehensive mechanical, electrical engineering, utility monitoring, and sustainability services, helping organizations make a difference and see the carbon and energy reductions happen. We also do so with a breadth of expertise of the talent of the people that we have here. I'm really proud of the team that we've assembled and the diversity that we bring with terms of experiences, geographic representation, backgrounds, and specialties. We're ones that focus on quality. It's really important for us that our reputation, is held up through the work of our staff and innovation throughout the years. And so we want to make sure that's a big part of what we do. Yeah, we like to put these sessions on about once a year. We do a lot of training work, but we like to do something a little bit different, especially topical in the industry. Past sessions in 2019 were about adaptation around low carbon resiliency in existing buildings, and also in 2020, a deep carbon retrofit approach for commercial buildings. Those are available on our website. A little challenge today with our website, but they will be available when our website's back up. And we encourage you to take a look at those. And it asks you a good icebreaker for today's session is we're going to have a question for you about those sessions. So we're going to ask you to take a picture or use your camera to scan the Slido image that you see, the QR code there, or just go to slido.com and use hashtag Prism. And we're going to have our first interactive question for the day. And we're going to get you to do that. And as soon as you have a chance to use that scan, then we'll go to our first question. And that is, how many of you attended one of our previous sessions? If you came to the adaptation towards climate resiliency, deep carbon, or not attended in the past, you can pick that one too. So we're looking for more responses. Some people have attended. We got 18 responses so far. Top right shows us how many are answering. Just want to get people familiar with the Slido tool. Gives us a chance to have some interactions throughout the session. So there were a couple of people that have come to the adaptation session, a bit more. They came to the deep carbon retrofit session. The majority haven't attended, and we'll leave that up for just another second or two, and then we'll get right into our session today. I think if I'm correct, the questions will stay there. We see the deep carbon and the adaptation numbers climbing. And thank you for participating, and encourage more of you to use the Slido as we interact together in this virtual session, this new reality that we're facing. So I'm going to have our first speaker, Julianne, share with us the context and the why we're here today. So Julianne, I'll turn over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. Okay, so I'm going to go over the why just to sort of set the context of what we're going to talk about today. So the obvious why is that the climate is changing. And there's events like forest fires and floods and tornadoes that are becoming more prevalent. They're increasingly being linked to climate change, and they're impacting both our personal and our professional lives. And this has led to a growing recognition of the need for action. And it's also led to global commitments. So internationally, Canada, along with many other countries, has agreed to take action on climate change to keep the global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably below 1.5. And we're seeing governments and organizations at many different levels setting these GHG emission targets. So in Canada, in BC, and many local governments have set targets, and so have many corporations and businesses. So you set your target, then what? You need to figure out how to move from targets to actions. And as the impacts of climate change become more evident, and as public support for climate action grows, the need to act swiftly and to be able to demonstrate the progress that you're making, those things are increasing. And as a result, detailed plans are needed. So in recent years, nationally, Canada started moving from targets to action through its climate action plans. So it started in 2017 with a pan-Canadian framework, and it's been followed by several updated climate plans since then. And then in BC, we have the CleanBC Plan, which has also been added to and updated over the years. And what we can see from these national and provincial level plans is that this is an iterative process. You know, it's not a set it and forget it type of plan. These are plans that have to evolve over time, and they're going to require regular updating. So before we delve into the how, which Sam is going to walk us through in a minute, I thought it was good just to touch briefly on some of the benefits and risks of, so the benefits of taking action and the risks of not taking action. And we're going to touch on two categories, financial risks and operational and social risks. So to begin with financial risks, there's certain things like price increases, for example. You've got utility rates and fuel costs. I mean, right now we're seeing the impact of the market volatility can have, you know, gas is well over $2 a liter, and that has a financial burden, you know, both to, in your personal lives and then also for organizations. There's also a carbon tax and offset payments in the public sector. So in 2022, BC's carbon tax rose from $45 to $50 a ton, and it's going to go all the way up to 170 tons by 2030. And what this means is that while GHG emissions were once sort of an externality, now they're becoming a cost and a liability for organizations. And then there's also operational and social risks to consider. So inaction on greenhouse gas emission reduction can lead to the increases in the amount of climate hazards, and this has financial as well as operational and social impacts. So we've got another Slido for you. We've talked a little bit of the risks. Now we're wondering about the benefits. So what are some of the benefits of reducing GHG emissions that you can think of? Okay, so it looks like a number of participants are typing away there. So we have air quality improvements, eco-justice, healthy cities, an improved reputation, less cost and offsets. Yeah, so we talked about the offsets and the carbon tax, more efficient processes, ESG considerations. Certainly this is starting to become a part of that sort of social corporate responsibility framework. Preventing world collapse, absolutely. Tackling global warming and making sure we have a habitable planet. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Those are all excellent examples. So in terms of the financial benefits, there's, decreased utility and fuel costs. There's also revenue opportunities potentially if you're able to generate carbon credits. And right now there's a lot of emission reduction funding available, in the form of rebates and grants and things like that. So in some ways, the time to act has never been better. And then other benefits, if we're looking at sort of the operational and social benefits, there's employee recruitment and retention, environmental and health benefits. Somebody mentioned air quality. And then there's also this equity, social justice piece and brand impacts. People want to buy products and invest in companies that align with their personal values. So as you can see, there's many benefits realized from taking action and risks associated with not doing so. And Sam's going to walk us through the how now of GHG planning.
Excellent. Thanks, Julianne. Great to kind of get the overview, set the context of why we're here. And I'm going to get a little bit more into the planning side of things now. Understanding the context, what do we do with that? And how do we tackle this in our organizations? It's a daunting task at times. Some of us have taken steps in certain areas, but maybe not looked at things strategically and holistically. So I'm going to go through a bit of an approach and present that here in this next piece that leans on these 6 steps that we're going to talk about one at a time here. And then in the case studies that we'll get into later on, we'll demonstrate how we've been able to actually implement and work with organizations to run through these steps. So what we often see with organizations is quite often jumping to step 2, where we have targets that are set, but not necessarily having done kind of the homework beforehand and really tried to get a good understanding of assessing the current situation. What do we have? What are we dealing with? Where do we want to go? Establishing that vision in step 2 as well is really critical. Then we need to get into step 3 here, where we understand the systems, the buildings or the fleet or other areas of scope that we have in our GHG portfolio and identify what those opportunities are. What is it that we can do with those systems, with the fleet, with the buildings, with transportation that can help to reduce our GHG impact. Once we get a good list of opportunities, we need to figure out which order we implement those in. And there's different ways that we can do that. So we're going to see some examples as we get into it of how we can optimize the different pathways for GHG reduction as we go. Then we need to plan for and implement those particular projects. And lastly, measure and adjust. So closing the loop, seeing how we're doing, checking and then readjusting our plan and coming back into step 1 as needed. So this is an iterative approach. It's not start to finish, very much like strategic energy management. For those that are familiar with that concept, we're not just, it's not a project, this is a process, and we need to come back in and reiterate things. There's no perfect way to do it. What we really want to encourage organizations to do is just to jump in. You can't go wrong by jumping in, but there is a strategic approach here, and it does help to follow these steps as best we can. So I'm going to get into these steps here. So the first step here is assessing the current situation. And there's definitely, the question is sort of where do we begin? And we get asked this a lot by organizations that we work with. Where do we go from here? We know that we need to do it. Our stakeholders are knocking on the door telling us what we need to do. We've got interest. We know we need to do something. Where do we begin? Well, place that we typically recommend in terms of beginning and the planning stage here is conducting an internal review and an external scan and engaging people. So the internal review is really looking at what we already have in place. What are the policies? What are the plans? What do we have? What's missing? A bit of a gap analysis that way. What are the priorities of the organization? And how does GHG reduction and planning fit into other organizational priorities that we might already have? A lot of organizations do have climate action plans in place or sustainability goals and objectives. How can we tie it into those sides of the business? External scan. What are our peers doing? What are other similar organizations doing? What's our federal government doing? Our provincial government, local municipalities? Julianne sort of walked us through the different goals and targets that they have. So how can we perhaps think about trying to align with what they're doing? And the third one here, and in many ways the most important one, is engaging people. It's people that need to be part of this process to reduce emissions. And if we try to do it in a little box on our own, we're not going to have nearly the same traction as if we engage people and bring them in right from the beginning to help us with that, particularly leadership. So, and we'll talk more about engaging people shortly here too. We also want to focus on using the right data. Again, we need to be able to measure and manage what we're doing in terms of emissions and energy. Is an example shown here from Puma, which is an EMIS utility monitoring software package that we run here. Example here, this is a post-secondary institution. There's 4 different campuses and different ways to present the data here, but the bottom right graph looks at the emissions avoided there by campus, and that's normalized for weather. So we have a good way of digging into and determining where our emissions are going, where we should focus those efforts. But we need to have those measurement systems in place right from the get-go. So once we've done our kind of homework, we've really understood where we're at, we've done that gap analysis, we can then dive into step 2. And this is establishing the vision and the targets. And one of the best ways to do that we find is to have a workshop of sorts. There's obviously a host of different ways that we could run a workshop or facilitate a workshop, starting to see more of that in person now, which is great. But we want to ask people, what are their thoughts? What are their priorities? What are their ideas for reducing emissions? What do people see as challenges to meet these decarbonization goals? And what are our boundaries for the scope that we're trying to do? Are we just looking at buildings? Are we looking at fleet? We talk about scope 1, 2, 3 emissions in terms of greenhouse gases. We won't dive into that, but where are we going to draw that dotted line? What are we going to try to control? Whoops. And then our approach to targets. Lucille, if you could go back one slide, please. When we come up with the targets, there's a few different ways that we can do that. We can do it from the top down, where we would actually look and lean on what other organizations are doing. So we could lean, as Julianne mentioned, some of the municipal and government targets that we see out there. We could certainly align our targets with those. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But we might also want to come at it from the bottom up. And in doing that, we're actually going to look at what the opportunities are within our facilities and within our fleet and calculate and come up with some numbers of what we feel could be attainable reductions. And maybe we'd add a little bit to that to be a bit more aggressive. But if we come at it those 2 different ways, in other words, doing both, really that's the most strategic way of trying to come up with targets, rather than just pulling numbers out of thin air that we do see happen sometimes. It's good to have a target, but what does that target mean? We need to understand it. We need to make sure that we can actually have a plan to achieve it, because we're in a position now that we need to make this happen. It's kind of, as Robert said at the beginning, timing is everything, and we need to really take action. So we need to have these targets well thought out. So a quick question here on Slido. Does your organization currently have a GHG emission reduction target? So I'll give you a minute just to enter that in, and just keen to hear from organizations where we're at here. We have a target. Looks like the majority so far, 11 participants have entered that so far. fair number in the process to develop one, and a few that haven't yet developed one, which is fine too. So good to see a majority here already have a target in place. I know there's a lot of organizations still working to kind of how figure out how best to merge our energy reduction targets with our GHG reduction targets too. So interesting to see those results. I'll leave that open. I think, Neil, that'll stay open, and I'm going to move on, but others are welcome to add into that here as well. Okay, so the third step in this 6-step process here is really trying to understand the systems that we have in place and identify projects. Now, there's a lot of different ways that we can come up with ideas for projects. And in many ways, it's people that come up with those ideas, either bringing in consultants. There's a lot of resources that organizations have in-house, engaging people, having suggestion programs. We talk about doing treasure hunts as well and getting people involved in identifying projects on site. But one of the key things that I want to stress here is the approach that we take to identifying projects. And this is another 6-step approach, not to confuse the previous one here. This is a subset of step 3 in the GHG planning 6-step process here. But when we get into identifying projects on site, these are the steps that we like to follow. And first of all, we want to focus on optimizing systems. What is it that we can do just to reduce waste? Those are going to be the cheapest and easiest low-cost opportunities to implement. We then move into improving efficiency. So this is where we start spending a bit more money, looking at equipment upgrades, system redesign, maintenance really falls into here as well in terms of improving efficiency. Then heat recovery, before we move into these last steps here of low carbon electrification or fuel switching, perhaps, where we look at heat pumps and actually changing where our energy is coming from, trying to look at lower carbon energy sources. Renewable energy, definitely an option here for helping close that gap to net zero. And then lastly is offsets. And there's different ways that we can procure and go about closing the gap there with offsets. Renewable natural gas, we're starting to see more of that as an offer from FortisBC and others as well. So looking to that in the future as well. So we like to take the 6-step approach to make sure that we're really trying to do things in the most strategic way that we can. So once we've done that and come up with opportunities, we then have a list of projects. We're going to need to figure out how best to model that. We might have come up with 100 different opportunities that we could undertake in our facilities, but what makes sense to implement first, second, third? And there's ways that we can look at that. We're going to see some examples in the case studies coming up. We'll dive more into that carbon pathways modeling that we talk about here. This is an example on this slide of a recent project that we work with, a municipality here in BC, where they had a goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2040. This was one of the pathways that we modeled. And you can see here where the orange line is the business as usual, the projected emissions if we don't do anything. The gray is the baseline. That's what we're trying to reduce our emissions against. That's our comparator. And then the blue is our total GHG emissions. This is the forecasted emissions based on implementing projects in a certain sequence. Fifth step here is planning and implementing. So again, really good to bring people back into the mix here, involve people, potentially have another workshop to plan, talk about implementation considerations. How are we going to undertake training? How are we going to bring our operators up to speed with new systems we might have? How are we going to ensure that commissioning of those systems is really undertaken in an effective way so that we're really achieving persistent results from the systems that we have? And then finally, we move into the last step, and this is measurement and adjusting. Again, we need to be able to have a good sense of what impact we're having on our emissions through measurement. We need good metering. We need good systems in place. This is a soon to be released feature in Puma where we're actually able to, on a site basis, look at how various sites in a portfolio are doing in terms of meeting or not meeting our emission reduction targets. So a little dashboard, kind of key indicators here in terms of how we're doing to meet those emission targets. Another way that might be presented here is an example here from Maine and down in the US. The data is a little old, but the concept of the graph remains the same. And here they're on the light gray curve, they're plotting their projected targets. This is where they would like to be in terms of meeting their emission reduction targets. The dark blue line is showing how they're actually doing and tracking that. And so at least back in sort of the 2018, 2019 here, they were looking to be on track to meet their emission reduction targets. So another way that we could graphically present that in a way that's quite easy to digest for those that are involved. So that takes us through the 6 steps there. And with that, I will pause and hand back to Robert.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Just maybe to go to the next slide would be great. So we're going to keep looking for questions in the chat, and I'm going to hold off posing questions for Sam for that section and wait till we hear a couple of case studies, and then based on those case studies, we'll have a chance to hear some questions. And we'll make sure there is time after each one of those to get into a bit of Q&A. I think we'll start now, though, by having Liz come and join us to share the story of the city of Abbotsford. And then Sam, you'll come back after. We'll hear from you again. So Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Sam, for the overview there. So we're going to dive into some work we've done. We wrapped up this spring with the city of Abbotsford. So the city of Abbotsford is probably in a similar situation to where it sounds like a lot of you are in that Slido poll, where you've got some targets, but you're in need of some direction on how we're going to implement this. It's a big project, especially for a lot of, the municipalities. There's lots of buildings. So let's just take a quick view here of the overview of our 6 steps real quick. We're going to go into Abbotsford 1 through 5. We haven't quite gotten to 6 yet because we just finished up, they were in the midst of number 5, but we'll get a good feel for the first 5 steps with this case study. So, the city of Abbotsford is quite a large place. They've got about 344 city-owned facilities, and they are not sure where, when they came to us, they weren't sure what their baseline was. They weren't 100% sure where their 2020 emissions profile was. So that's where we started, was assessing the current situation. So we reviewed all of their historical data, had it uploaded to Puma. So thanks to the Puma team. And we're able to collect all of the data and estimate any historical data that was missing to create a good understanding of what the 2007 baseline actually means. And we also did an analysis of, okay, as a municipality, they were a part of the CAREP reporting requirements. Now that CAREP is done, what is the next step? How are we going to report? And so it was a review of what are our Abbotsford's gap analysis? What greenhouse gas emissions are they missing? For example, are we getting all of our contractors counted for? What scope are we going to account for? And so putting that together, we were able to come up with a policy that identified gaps and identified how to report the emissions going forward in a consistent way. And we're able to create policy around that. And so step 2, as I'm sure everyone here, most of us have done, is we've got some targets, and whether they were, decided upon by, the provincial or municipal level or federal, the city of Abbotsford back in 2016, which is quite a long time ago, if you think about it, set some reduction targets for 20% reduction below 2000 level by 2025 and 40% reduction by 2040. So they knew where they were going. And from step 1, we knew where we are. So on to step 3 is figuring out, okay, we need to understand our systems and identify projects to get us there. So what we were able to do with the city of Abbotsford and all this data that we'd put into Puma was come out with a you can see this model on the right, and this is the output. So the light blue line at the top is business as usual, and you can see a breakdown by each department, and you can see there's a couple departments that have some significant emissions. And so the important thing to note for this model is we are able to look at, okay, we know their facilities, we know what the buildings look like, and we can estimate what kinds of projects that we can do, retrofits or replacing equipment, or how do we design our new buildings, and also integrate any future technology changes. How are we going to do that? How are we going to piece that together to find a pathway to 40% reduction by 2040? So we were able to do that. And one of the biggest hurdles for the city of Abbotsford was their population growth. There was supposed to be significant population growth in the city of Abbotsford by 2040. And so we wanted to align the future plans for the city with this goal. So here's a zoom in on our graph here, and you can see that, you know, they worked it out. We've, you know, put together a bunch of plans and projects and identified them to get to this red line, which is the, you know, the 2040 40% reduction. And so here's what the, you know, kind of dashboard looks like. And if we zoom in, the important parts here are, okay, what's our target? We know it might change over time. We also have the population, and we can change in this model what the population growth projections are going to be. They're revised. I mean, maybe, who knows what happens in the next 10 years. The population is going to grow even further. So we have the ability here in this yellow box to adjust the impact of population on greenhouse gas emission growth over time. And then we can over time reduce or improve our confidence range in our greenhouse gas emission reduction projects. As we all know, projecting 15, 20 years out in the building lifestyle and your capital planning is kind of difficult. And so in the bottom view here, we have just a select view of, you know, projects that you can, you know, include and decide, okay, well, what year are we going to implement this? When is it going to make the most sense? How much is this going to save on a department basis, and how much is it going to save on a citywide basis? And then also, you know, cost is very important. You know, budgets aren't infinite, so being able to have an idea of what to set aside in the capital planning process is also a helpful. But again, this is an iterative project, and this is a model that is interactive. So over time, the city can then refine the assumptions that were made to better reflect where the city is. Okay, step 5. So this is the, you know, plan and implement. So sure, we've done all this great work identifying, you know, potential projects and where we should go, but okay, now we need to actually do it. And so the city of Abbotsford in June was able to take their building strategy for corporate emissions to council, and so that included a strategy for, you know, new construction, also for asset planning, and trying to align within the organization all of the different departments and their greenhouse gas emission goals and targets. And so they're currently in the phase of planning and implementing and working to the stakeholders within the city to get the plan that we have created, the model that we've created, some legs, and get it moving. So here's what they took to council and how they're communicating with their stakeholders, the city of Abbotsford, citizens at large, basically explaining very similar to what we're talking about here in our 6-step process. And we worked with them on this communication to communicate what they're doing and how they're doing it and how they're going to get to their targets. So that is the quick overview of the City of Abbotsford project. I guess we'll be taking some questions now.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. What I really appreciated about that example is that you connected the top down and the bottom up, and you demonstrated that, you know, they had some targets. They had a target of 40% reduction, and then your challenge was to model the various pathways of getting there over time. And you were able to do that not just arbitrarily, but rather looking at the inventory of equipment and assigning replacement or retrofit estimates as you go through that. So I really appreciate it. Any questions directly for City of Abbotsford for Liz, we can take those in the chat now. So I'll look for you to put that in the chat. Maybe I'll jump over to whoever has slide control now. Lucille, we go to slide 40 for a second, 40 enter. The question came up from Bryce. Sam, maybe you can address this one. Bryce is wondering if we've ever deviated from this pathway to net zero, especially this, the GHG management hierarchy here. For example, prioritizing the renewable energy credits before energy efficiency. So that's a bit of a philosophical one, but Sam, do you want to try taking that one on?
Yeah, sure. Great question, Bryce. And I mean, bottom line is nothing is set in stone. And what we're really trying to propose, suggest here is that this is a good approach. It's a strategic approach. It makes sense to try to do everything we can to minimize waste and maximize efficiency in our buildings before we jump to those more kind of costly ways of closing the gap to net zero, like renewable energy credits. If you were to go ahead and jump right into renewable energy credits, there's nothing wrong with that, but you might be sort of doing a bit of a disservice to not looking at those lower cost opportunities first and easier ways to do that. So we really try to focus in the work that we do on minimizing waste and really trying to tighten our belt within the facilities that we work with before jumping to those other ways of closing the gap. And yeah, Kevin, I see your point in the chat there too. Yeah, it's sort of a lower cost approach is to try to follow these 6 steps. So yeah, hopefully that gives some insight into that.
Yeah, it seems to be a long-term solution too. Like if we reduce waste in the long run and we improve efficiency in the long run, you no longer have to buy those renewable energy credits on an ongoing basis. So that ties in really well. All right, thank you, Sam. And maybe we'll go back to Lucille, just get you to go to cover slide here for Abbotsford. So slide 50, back to Abbotsford. Bryce, you get the next question again, because we have one for Liz. So Liz, for the city of Abbotsford, was your action planning mostly constrained to the building stock, or did it include the fleets?
Yeah, so way back in step 1, we did a review of the existing policy that they had, not just regarding fleet, but also including fleet. And they have a pretty robust plan for fleet before they came to us, which was great. So we were able to integrate that into our model, and not just the plans that up with, but also, for example, technology change over time. So, buying, 100 EVs 10 years from now is likely going to be cheaper than buying 100 EVs now. So, to answer the question, our portion really focused on building stock, but we were able to take a second eye on their fleet policy and say, yeah, we didn't see many gaps in there, because they'd already done a comprehensive review of their fleet policy.
So the modeling work that Liz did included sort of planning when various types of vehicles would be replaced and electrified, and that was done by looking at a range of years when that would happen. So that was one of the approaches that was used for that one. And I know we're going to keep going to our next case study, but maybe we'll take one last question here from Ellie. How have the temporary shocks, like the current spikes in fuel costs, affected your recommendation? Are those ignored in favor of long-term view, or is it something you have to monitor? Liz, get you to comment on the fuel price and recommendations.
Yeah, and that was something that we were able to build in as a variable to see how that could impact. So when we did our cost analysis, we included, a future price of implementing these measures, and also an escalation rate of greenhouse gas emitting costs, basically, be it carbon or just fuel cost spikes. So that's something they can build into the model, and then again the iterative process be like, maybe this doesn't make sense this year with this spike. We can change around some measures. So it requires whoever is doing the planning to take an iterative approach and review every year, and that's step 6 is to go back and look and see how the landscape has changed. Like I said, City of Abbotsford, made their plans in 2016. I mean, we hadn't heard of President Trump then. And now it's 2022. So think of what has changed in the past 6 years. So the long view is important, but we can't ignore these short spikes and these short-term impacts.
Thanks, Liz. We'll keep going with some of the questions in our next Q&A, but I want to move on to our next case study in the city of Burnaby. We're going to hear back from Sam again on the city's project that he led.
Great, thanks, Robert and Liz and Roberto. I do see one question from you. I'm going to address it as part of my slide deck here for Burnaby. We'll talk about residual value and equipment there. So another project that Prism worked on here with the city of Burnaby, and the city of Burnaby came to us with having already done step 1 and 2. And so the focus for this project was really on steps 3 and 4, where we really wanted to dive deep, understand systems, look at opportunities for ways that they could reduce carbon emissions in their buildings. We looked at over 50 different buildings with another consultant as well as part of that. And then we did some modeling similar to what Liz presented for Abbotsford, but here really to try to drill down again and find out what the optimum pathway is for them to move forward and implement those. And we looked at different scenarios. So we'll get into that. The planning and the implementation, the city of Burnaby is now starting to move forward with, which is great, really kind of leading the charge that way. So thank you to the city of Burnaby for letting us share this example. And I know from them, they're keen for others to learn from this as well and to try to do similar work. It's a great approach. What we did is we went and we reviewed, in this case, they were more kind of walk-through energy audits or decarbonization studies for over 50 different buildings. And we came up with a list of opportunities or measures for those different buildings. You can see a snapshot here of this list. We looked at what the existing condition was, which also led into the piece around residual value. So we looked at how much equipment life was remaining for different pieces of equipment. To Roberto, to your question, we didn't actually look at residual value. So we didn't assign a dollar value to the equipment life remaining, but we assigned a time frame to that. So more of a simplistic way of approaching it. Ideally, yeah, the residual value would be a great way to build that up even further. So I like that idea that you present. It takes more time to do, but it could definitely be worthwhile for some systems, some buildings. Yeah. One of the things that we looked at here was in the very right-hand column, the investment per ton reduced. And this was one of the sort of key indexes that was used. So in other words, for every dollar that we put into that particular opportunity, how many tons of CO2 are we going to reduce? And so some of those are going to be much better. Some of them are going to be lower on that list. So we use that as a way to help prioritize the different pathways that we looked at. The different pathway scenarios that we modeled here, this was 4 different pathways. The first one here was based on an asset life basis. So this, again, leads into that point that Roberto made before. What is the residual life, in this case, not value, but residual life, that asset life remaining? So this pathway prioritized implementing measures that replaced equipment that was at near end of life first. So if something was brand new, we're not going to replace that tomorrow. We're going to wait until it's closer to end of life before we replace it, even if it might be a gas boiler, for example. So that was pathway A. Pathway B was looking at the GHG cost impact. So what now if we were to implement all the measures first that had the highest return on investment on a GHG per dollar invested, GHG reduced per dollar invested basis. So prioritizing based on that. Pathway C was a blended approach. So it kind of took a bit of a balance between pathway A and B here. And then pathway D was their goal, where the city has a target to be net zero on a corporate basis by 2040. So what sequence of measures do we need to implement, and how can we do that in such a way that we can achieve those targets? And so the results here that you see sort of between 38 and 100% GHG emission reductions if we go with that stretch target there. So let's take a look and see what that looked like in terms of the pathway. It's similar to the graph I presented before. This one, though, is for this net zero pathway. So there's a lot of assumptions that go into this model, much like what Liz presented for the city of Abbotsford. There's a lot of sensitivities. We're going to talk about that in a second and how we got around that. But you can see here that the lower blue line is the projected pathway to net zero by 2040. And this does lean on not just implementing projects, but it also leans on the fact that we're hoping and anticipating that our electricity emissions factor in BC will continue to reduce or decline over time. By how much, we don't know. We'll talk about that in a second, but we're assuming that it will continue to decrease. So that's one of the inputs to the model. We're also going to add more renewables. In this particular pathway, we're back to that 6-step process, renewables and carbon credits. We're right down at the very bottom. So we're going to be adding renewables. We're going to be putting solar PV on steroids and doing as much as we possibly can here to close the gap to net zero. And also leaning on renewable natural gas as a way to help with that as well. So if we combine all those things, we can find a pathway here where the city could achieve net zero by 2040. And obviously there's costs associated with doing that. We're not presenting those costs here, but we certainly have presented that to the city too, so that they can start planning financially for that. So there's a lot of advantages to undertaking these different pathway scenarios, and in particular, really to try to get an understanding of what this is going to look like from a project implementation, planning, and sequencing side of things. So I mentioned the sensitivity analysis. There's a lot of different inputs. Liz went through some of them in her example as well, that are going to have an impact on the results of this pathway and our ability to achieve the targets that we've set. One of the things is retrofit costs and savings. As we all know, it's very difficult to predict construction costs, especially at the moment. It's all over the place, and if anything, it's higher than we'd expect it to be. So that's a factor. Electricity emission factors, the carbon tax that's going to be increasing that Julianne mentioned. Well, what if federal policy change that could impact our federal carbon tax? What are we doing with asset disposals? Maybe we're getting rid of buildings. Maybe we're going to build some new ones. What's the availability of supply for renewables, and what new technologies might we be seeing in the future that could impact that? And then, of course, others as well. And just lastly here, before we kind of wrap this piece up, is that one of the key model inputs here, as I mentioned, is the integrated, or what we call the BC integrated grid electricity emission factor. This is the province publishes these values each year. More recently, they've updated the value to just under 9 tons per gigawatt hour, which you see on the graph here, which is a big drop from where it was a year ago, around 40. So we've seen that drop a lot recently. We anticipate that will continue to decline. By how much, we don't know, but certainly we can test the sensitivity of that in our model to see how that's going to impact the results. So with that, I want to wrap up, but I will just say as well that there's a lot of funding out there at the moment too for undertaking these sorts of projects. And for municipalities, there's funding through FCM, Federation of Canadian Municipalities, for this sorts of pathway planning. There's also, of course, funding out there from BC Hydro and CleanBC and FortisBC as well in terms of studies. So it's not like organizations have necessarily undertaken all of this themselves. There's definitely money to chase out there, and we can certainly help you line that up and figure out which is the best funding route to go through to help with these projects. Robert.
Yeah, Sam, I really appreciate the insights that you provided, and I particularly liked the slide where you showed us in your 4 pathways how we used to look at savings of 30 and 40% as being pretty good, and now we're looking at 80 and 100%. Seeing that it's feasible. So impressive amount of work there, and I think that we've come a long way. Maybe just a couple of questions here, Sam, and then we'll sort of wait and have a couple at the end as well. But I know you split your work between BC and Alberta, and you kind of address things in Alberta a little slightly different way in terms of the grid. Question for Paulina is, how much attention do you give grid decarbonization or grid decarbonizing while we improve the efficiency of buildings? How do those two marry up in your mind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And Alberta is definitely a different beast in that way, and a little harder to predict at the moment. We're seeing in Alberta that it's very sensitive to that grid emission factor, particularly in terms of that fuel switching to heat pumps. We talk about gas absorption heat pumps in BC. It's a challenge to kind of make it work from a decarbonization standpoint. In Alberta, it's a different ballgame. So we need to be paying close attention to the grid carbon, the grid intensity, the grid emission intensity factor as we move forward. Absolutely. There is, projections out there from various organizations, institutions in terms of what that might look like in the future, but a lot of it is crystal ball gazing and kind of, hope or knowing certain things, but politics certainly play into that too. So it's a tough one, but absolutely we need to pay attention to it, and we do build those factors in and that sensitivity into the models that we generate. So and the 6th point about adjusting is those factors change. In another year's time, we're going to know what that factor is, so we can go back in and update the model and readjust as needed.
And Sam, I've seen you work on this before, and some of the issues is that the selection of the pathways, when it includes decarbonization, might change based on the utility. And so what works in BC for electrification may not make the same sense in Alberta in all cases. Sometimes it still does, but you have to find that right balance. And certainly we're seeing a lot more interest in PV in the work that we're doing in Alberta, but there's still a fair bit of that here as well. I'm going to keep us going and have a chance to come back to a couple of questions at the end for you, Sam and Liz and Julianne, and just get us to sort of put a bow tie on this or wrap it up in terms of lessons learned. Some of the things that we've heard about today include a couple 6 that I'm going to highlight right now. Sometimes we focus on jumping right to setting a target, and we don't have a good sense of where we are and what we've done in the past. So I'm really recommending to take a step back and assess that current situation. That's a lesson that we've learned. We also heard about the strategy. The strategy is sort of combining a top-down, bottom-up. Some of the high-level projections with automated ways of coming up with plans get you to understand the ballpark that you can be in, but really going bottom up and understanding the assets that are there and how we can upgrade them and what the potential is for each of those assets, and building it up from the bottom up is really useful. And not only that, but finding the gap between what the bottom up and the top down are saying allows us to say we still have some uncertainties. We still know that we're not quite there, but we can start looking towards filling those gaps, and hopefully they shrink over time. The third lesson learned was timing's important, and the sooner the better. The longer the wait, the harder it is, the more expensive it is to achieve targets, and you shouldn't underestimate the time it takes to get there. It's by starting early and by thinking about how you can reduce your emissions, you can tie it into your other budgets, you can tie it into planning, and the tendering and construction aspects take time too. So time's ticking, and we're seeing projects go ahead. Now we're seeing projects that not uncommon in the multi-million-dollar range to get things happening. We have typically we used to have maybe one every couple of years. Now we have a couple of those every year where the clients are saying, yeah, we got to do this, and we're going to get the money and we're going to make this happen. So we're seeing much larger projects, and we're seeing them happen a lot quicker. The next lessons learned is about people. A lot of times we think about technology, but we need to look at going beyond technology and getting people involved. The ability to harness the knowledge that's in the room beyond your typical staff and to other stakeholders brings up new ideas. And we've seen that with deep retrofit projects, and we're seeing that with planning projects. And someone earlier today mentioned the question about fleet. I've been in GHG planning sessions where you have the director of fleet there, and you're talking about electric garbage trucks, and you're saying, when's it coming? And now we're seeing that it's happening. So the planning parts engage more than just the traditional facility staff into a wider audience. Another lesson learned is modeling inputs are there for us to be able to do some sensitivity testing and some adjustments. So there's many factors that could affect these pathways. Liz mentioned population growth. We've definitely heard from Julianne about climate change impacts. These are going to change how we perceive what the priorities are and what the needs are. We've certainly experienced more impacts in the province in the last year and a half on climate change than I can remember over decades. And so how that might inform our planning is certainly key. And lastly, I like to advocate, we say, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. We can start, and these plans could get adjusted, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't keep making plans. So really a chance for us to start and to make some progress in this. So I want to have a chance to go back. I know that some of the people are going to have to leave, so I'm going to before we go to more questions, I'm going to say that we really appreciate our clients and the relationships that we've developed over the years with you, and we're really pleased that you joined us for this webinar. And I want to just provide kudos to Liz, Julianne, Sam, and everyone that supported them, Lucille and Shelby and Tennille in the background for putting on today's session. We do have some time and some questions that have come up, which I think Sam's tried to answer while I've been wrapping up. But Sam, do you want to entertain a couple that you haven't, or direct them to Liz, since I've seen the chat going a little berserk here. So maybe you can tell me what hasn't been answered and what you might want to point to Liz or Julianne.
Yeah, I think we're kind of on top of the Q&A here, actually. So Kevin has coined a new term for us, though, efficiency. So we'll maybe build that one into the next webinar, Kevin. Thank you. But yeah, certainly open to any other questions that we have here. Feel free to open up your mic or add in the chat if you like there as well.
How about the embodied carbon topic? We heard George ask about embodied carbon and how we're dealing with that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and the short answer is that at this point in time, the industry is not really dealing with that much in terms of factoring it into this. Personally, I think it's going to be where things go. I think we're going to start to see more emphasis on embodied carbon as we move forward into the next few years here. Certainly, yeah, it's not it makes things much more complicated, but it's important. Like you said before, I think in your example, if we go put solar PV panels on the roof, sure, we offset already clean electricity, but what about the embodied carbon of that product, and what do we do with that product when it's at the end of life? Can we recycle it? And so there's so much more in this kind of cradle to grave type of analysis that really we do need to be doing, I'd like to see us go there, and we will go there, but at the moment it's sort of not being brought into many of the requests that we're seeing. So yeah,
if I could jump in there, Sam. Part of the work we did with the city of Abbotsford was they're in the middle of developing a corporate new construction policy. And so part of our work with them was, okay, what's the best path forward for all these new buildings? I mean, I like to call it kind of their structural carbon already exists. The embodied carbon that they already own and the way their buildings are operating, but they're really forward thinking about like, okay, well, when we build new buildings, what is this embodied carbon going to be? And so our recommendation was, it's going to become part of building code at some point, we're sure. And there's already we did a review of some of the, for example, LEED, the CAGBC came out with a net zero building kind of guidelines or program that includes accounting for embodied carbon. So it's coming, and we recommended for that to be part of the city of Abbotsford's approach. But like Sam said, it's just in its infancy of development and the chatter within the industry.
Right. And thanks, Liz. We also will point out that for commercial energy managers, BC Hydro has a webinar on July 21st in the morning on embodied carbon specifically and how it fits in with projects. So that might be something commercial energy managers are interested in. George is an industrial energy manager. We can probably arrange to get you an invitation to that too. So get in touch with your coach, and we can work through seeing if we can get you to come to that one. A lot of thank yous, a lot of kudos. We'll stay on if anyone wants to chat. Maybe we'll stop the recording at this point, Lucille, and I think a lot of people are signing off at this point. So I'll leave that for if anyone that wants to unmute themselves.